I am Brandon Whitaker. I'm 41 years old, and until recently I believed I had a stable, predictable life built on logic, routine, and mutual respect. I work as a network security consultant in Columbus, Ohio, which means I spend most of my days thinking about firewalls, vulnerabilities, and silent threats that slip in through unnoticed openings. The irony of what happened to my marriage does not escape me now. The story truly began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break when I opened Instagram out of pure habit, expecting nothing more than food photos and office memes, and instead saw a post from my wife, Lauren Whitaker, 39, that read in bold, defiant text, "No man controls who I talk to." She did not tag me. She did not use my name. But every single one of our mutual friends knew exactly who she meant because the night before we had a tense, emotionally exhausting argument about her reconnecting with an old college flame named Derek. Derek was someone I had only heard about in fragments over the years, a guy from her theater days at Western Lake University, the kind of charismatic, dramatic personality who always seemed to exist in stories filled with nostalgia and laughter. He had recently divorced, and almost immediately after that, he began messaging Lauren late at night, sending inside jokes from rehearsals 20 years ago, old production photos where they stood too close together backstage, and comments that carried a tone that was far more intimate than friendly. At first I tried to be reasonable. I told myself that people reconnect with old friends all the time and that I had no right to dictate who she spoke to, but the pattern began to bother me. The notifications would light up her phone at 11, sometimes midnight, and she would angle the screen slightly away from me without even realizing she was doing it. The night before that Instagram post, I had finally told her that it made me uncomfortable. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused her of anything. I simply said that a recently divorced ex sending flirty messages at midnight did not feel appropriate for a married woman. She immediately grew defensive, her tone sharpening as if I had insulted her character instead of expressing concern. She said I was being insecure, that I was trying to police her friendships, that I was projecting my own issues. The conversation escalated in that quiet, icy way arguments sometimes do, where no one screams but the distance between you becomes visible and heavy. I went to bed feeling unsettled but still convinced that we would talk it through like adults the next day. Instead, I woke up to that public statement disguised as empowerment but aimed directly at me. Seeing it there, polished and filtered for an audience, felt humiliating in a way I had not anticipated. It was not just a disagreement anymore, it was a narrative. Mutual friends began liking the post within minutes. A few left comments about independence and boundaries. I sat there in my office break room, staring at my phone while my coffee went cold, realizing that a private marital concern had been reframed as me being some controlling husband. What bothered me most was not Derek himself, but the shift in Lauren's behavior. She started guarding her phone, turning it face down when she set it on the table. She laughed at messages and then quickly minimized the screen when I glanced over. When I mentioned it again later that week, she accused me of surveillance, of not trusting her. I tried to explain that trust is not blind acceptance, that it is built on transparency, but she dismissed it as paranoia. The more I attempted to communicate calmly, the more she seemed to dig in her heels, as if admitting that the situation looked inappropriate would somehow validate my entire argument. By the end of that Tuesday, I realized something had changed between us that went deeper than a single Instagram post or a late-night message thread. It felt like the first visible crack in something I had always assumed was solid. And for the first time in our 12 years of marriage, I was not entirely sure that the threat was external. 4 months before that Instagram post ever appeared, I had been noticing subtle shifts in Lauren's behavior that on their own might have seemed insignificant, but together formed a pattern I could no longer ignore, because she began angling her phone away from me when we sat on the couch in the evenings, tilting the screen just enough so I could not casually glance at it the way married people normally do without suspicion. And then she added a new passcode after years of us knowing each other's, claiming it was for privacy, even though nothing about our relationship had previously required that level of secrecy. I remember the first time I realized she had changed it, because I had picked up her phone to check the time while mine was charging, and she reacted with a sharpness that felt disproportionate, immediately reaching over and saying she would handle it herself, her tone defensive in a way that suggested I had crossed an invisible line that had not existed before. The notifications that once chimed freely throughout our house began to fall silent whenever I entered a room, because she started muting them during dinner, during movie nights, even while we were brushing our teeth, and, at first I told myself she was simply trying to be more present. But that theory collapsed when I noticed the faint glow of her screen lighting up in her lap while we watched television, followed by her quickly turning it face down, as if instinctively shielding it from view. She began stepping outside to take calls she claimed were from her cousin, slipping onto the back patio in the evenings with her voice lowered and her posture tense. And when I would ask casually how her cousin was doing, she would respond with vague summaries that lacked the kind of detail one normally shares after a real family conversation. What unsettled me most was not a single action, but the cumulative effect of all of them, because I could feel a quiet wall being built between us brick by brick, and every time I tried to address it calmly, she would accuse me of imagining things. When Derek started sending her throwback pictures of them dressed as Romeo and Juliet at a campus costume gala from their theater days at Western Lake University, complete with captions about chemistry that never fades and memories that still make him smile, I finally told her that it made me uncomfortable to see my wife exchanging nostalgic, intimate photographs with a man who had just finalized a divorce. I did not yell. I did not accuse her of cheating. I simply said that the frequency and tone of their late-night conversations felt inappropriate for a married woman, especially when those conversations stretched past midnight 3 times a week. Instead of acknowledging how it might look from my perspective, she immediately flipped the narrative and accused me of being insecure and controlling, as if my discomfort was evidence of a character flaw rather than a reaction to behavior that had objectively changed. She told me that healthy relationships require trust, that I was projecting my own fears, that I was trying to dictate who she could and could not speak to, and somehow the focus shifted entirely away from Derek's persistent messages and onto my supposed lack of confidence. I found myself defending my right to feel unsettled rather than discussing why my wife was prioritizing lengthy, private conversations with another man during hours that used to belong to us. The dynamic became disorienting because every attempt I made to express concern was reframed as an attack on her autonomy, and she began using language that painted me as a restrictive husband trying to limit her social circle, even though I had never objected to her male co-workers, her old classmates, or any other friendships in the past. The only difference with Derek was the timing, the secrecy, and the emotional undertone that felt far too personal for someone outside our marriage. Each time I brought up the pattern, she would remind me that she had done nothing physically wrong, as if fidelity were measured solely by physical boundaries rather than emotional ones, and I felt myself slowly becoming the villain in a story I had never intended to write, simply because I asked why my wife was texting another man until midnight multiple times a week. Instead of arguing publicly or firing back with a defensive paragraph that would have turned our private conflict into a spectacle, I commented under her post with a single line that read, "Not this man," and then I logged off without waiting to see who liked it or how she would respond, because I refused to participate in what felt like a carefully staged performance designed to paint me as controlling, while she collected validation from an audience that did not know the full story. My comment was not dramatic, not hostile, not accusatory. It was simply a quiet boundary placed in plain view, and once it was posted I felt an unexpected sense of clarity settle over me, as if I had finally chosen not to chase a narrative that was already being rewritten in real time. That evening, after work, I drove home to our townhouse in Brookhaven Heights with a calmness that surprised even me, because instead of rehearsing arguments in my head, I mentally cataloged what I would need for a temporary exit, and when I walked through the door, Lauren was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between irritated and expectant, as if she were waiting for me to apologize for having disrupted her storyline. I did not yell, I did not slam doors, I did not accuse her of anything. I simply walked upstairs, opened our closet, and pulled out a small suitcase that we usually use for weekend trips, folding a few pairs of jeans, work shirts, undergarments, and toiletries with deliberate precision. Every movement felt methodical, almost clinical, like I was preparing for a business trip rather than stepping away from my own home, and perhaps that emotional detachment was the only way I could keep from unraveling. When she finally noticed what I was doing and asked what I thought I was proving, I told her calmly that I was not trying to prove anything. I was removing myself from a situation that had been turned into a public debate, and that if she wanted to frame me as controlling online, then I would give her the space she seemed so determined to claim. I carried the suitcase downstairs without waiting for her reaction, grabbed my laptop bag from the dining table, and walked out the front door into the quiet suburban evening without slamming it behind me, because I refused to let my departure look like a tantrum. I checked into a modest extended-stay hotel near the interstate, the kind of place with neutral carpeting, humming air conditioners, and a faint smell of disinfectant that never quite fades. And when I set my suitcase on the bed and sat down for the first time that day, my phone began vibrating almost immediately. The first few texts from Lauren were measured. "Reading, we need to talk," and "Please come home so we can sort this out." But within minutes they evolved into accusations like, "Why are you overreacting, and you're embarrassing me by making this look like cheating?" As if my decision to step away was somehow more humiliating than her decision to broadcast our disagreement to hundreds of followers. I watched the messages stack up without responding, each vibration reinforcing the reality that she was more concerned with how things appeared than with why I felt compelled to leave in the first place. There was something surreal about sitting alone in a sterile hotel room while my marriage unraveled through a glowing screen, because I had not made a scene, I had not threatened divorce, I had not publicly attacked her character. I had simply refused to continue participating in a dynamic where my discomfort was dismissed and then weaponized for social validation. As the evening wore on and the interstate traffic hummed faintly through the window, I realized that for the first time in months, I was not scanning her body language, not watching the angle of her phone, not wondering who she was messaging, and the silence in that small room felt less like loneliness and more like relief, because all I had done was remove myself from a public performance she chose to stage, and in doing so I had reclaimed at least one boundary that no caption or comment could redefine. Over the next 4 days, Lauren escalated everything online with a level of theatrical confidence that made it clear she believed the court of public opinion was firmly on her side, because she changed her profile bio to independent woman, as if our marriage had been some oppressive regime she had finally escaped, and she began posting vague, curated quotes about outgrowing men who only love in private, carefully selected lines that suggested emotional neglect without ever mentioning specifics. While her friends flooded the comments with clapping emojis, fire symbols, and thinly veiled jokes about fragile husbands who cannot handle strong women, I watched it unfold from the quiet anonymity of my extended stay hotel room, scrolling without reacting, observing how quickly a complex marital disagreement had been reduced to a digestible narrative where she was reclaiming her voice and I was the invisible antagonist whose only crime was discomfort. The irony was that offline her tone shifted entirely once she realized I was not engaging in the digital back and forth she seemed prepared for, because instead of posting rebuttals or begging in the comments, I made practical decisions that required no hashtags and no applause. I logged into our banking accounts and removed her as an authorized user on my primary credit card, a card I had opened years before we married and maintained as the backbone of our household expenses, and I did it calmly, without anger, because if she wanted independence publicly, then I saw no reason to maintain financial entanglements that contradicted that declaration. I paused our shared cloud storage subscription, not to erase memories or punish her, but to stop subsidizing a digital ecosystem that now felt less like shared space and more like surveillance. And I sent a concise email to our accountant requesting that he prepare individual expense summaries for the past 2 years, so we could clearly delineate personal and joint spending should that become necessary. Each action was methodical and deliberate, framed not as retaliation, but as alignment with the autonomy she had so boldly proclaimed in front of thousands of followers, and when she noticed the changes, her response shifted from confident empowerment to visible panic. The first sign came in a string of texts asking why her card had declined at a boutique downtown, followed by a more pointed message demanding to know why she no longer had access to the shared storage, where she kept her promotional content and archived photos. I responded with measured clarity, explaining that since she had publicly emphasized her independence and rejection of control, I assumed she preferred financial and digital autonomy as well, and that separating accounts was simply a logical extension of that philosophy. Her calls came shortly after, her voice no longer sharp with defiance, but tight with urgency, accusing me of blindsiding her and overreacting financially, insisting that independence did not mean disentangling practical matters, as though independence were purely symbolic and meant only for captions rather than consequences. I reminded her that marriage is built on partnership and transparency, and that if she was comfortable redefining our dynamic publicly, then I was comfortable ensuring our legal and financial boundaries reflected whatever direction she believed we were heading. Meanwhile, her social media continued projecting strength and liberation. Posts about growth and boundaries accumulating likes from acquaintances who had no idea that behind the scenes, she was scrambling to understand how quickly narrative power shifts when symbolism meets structure. The contrast between her online bravado and her offline anxiety was stark, because while she curated quotes about self-sufficiency, she had not anticipated that self-sufficiency would require actual self-management of expenses, subscriptions, and accountability. I did not raise my voice, I did not threaten, and I did not insult her character. I simply treated her public statements as declarations of intent and adjusted my behavior accordingly. And in doing so, I realized that the loudest statements in any relationship are not always the ones typed into a caption, but the quiet administrative decisions that redefine reality without ever needing an audience. When Lauren realized she could no longer casually access the streaming services we had shared for years, could not place dinner orders through food delivery apps without re-entering her own payment information, and most importantly, could not transfer money from our joint savings account without contacting me directly, The tone of her messages shifted almost overnight from sharp defiance to trembling indignation, and she began sending long voice notes where her earlier confidence dissolved into tears as she accused me of punishing her over one harmless post. I listened to those recordings in the quiet of my hotel room, her voice cracking as she insisted that she had only been expressing herself, that social media was not real life, that I was taking things too far by making structural changes in response to something she framed as emotional venting. In those messages, she repeated the phrase, "It was just a post," as if repetition could shrink the context around it, as if the weeks of secrecy, the midnight conversations with Derek, the carefully angled phone screen, the changed passcode, and the public caption implying I was controlling could all be reduced to a single innocent expression of independence. She described my financial separation as retaliation, as cruelty, as evidence that I wanted to control her through money, completely ignoring that I had not restricted her ability to earn or spend her own income, but had merely withdrawn my own support from systems she seemed to resent. The irony was heavy, because the same woman who had publicly declared that no man controls who she talks to was now distressed that she had to call me to ask why her streaming subscription had expired. For the first few days I did not respond at all, because silence in that moment felt more honest than another circular argument. But when the voice messages escalated into sobbing pleas mixed with accusations that I was destroying our marriage over pride, I decided to answer once and only once. I typed a single message that read, "It was not the post, but the intent," and I chose those words carefully because the caption itself was not the true fracture. The fracture was the decision to frame a private marital concern as oppression for the sake of public applause. I told her that what hurt was not a sentence on Instagram, but the willingness to gather validation from strangers rather than resolve conflict with the person she had promised to build a life with, that she had chosen applause over partnership and validation over loyalty, and that once those priorities are revealed, they cannot simply be edited like a caption. I explained that independence is not something granted by an audience, but something lived through responsibility, and that if she wanted to present herself as entirely autonomous, then it required more than aesthetic declarations. It required practical accountability, including managing her own expenses, subscriptions, and digital infrastructure. I made it clear that I was not interested in punishing her. I was interested in stepping out a narrative where I had been reduced to a controlling caricature, while she collected support for standing up to me. I refused to continue being a background character in a digital empowerment storyline that painted me as oppressive simply because I expressed discomfort with another man occupying emotional space in my marriage. After sending that message, I put my phone down and did not engage further, because I understood that any additional explanation would only invite more reframing, more distortion of motive, more attempts to shift focus away from the core issue. Her tears in those voice messages did not erase the intentionality behind the public statements, and her wounded tone did not negate the months of secrecy that preceded them. What changed in me during those days was not anger, but clarity, the realization that respect cannot coexist with performance, and that once someone chooses the crowd over the covenant, stepping out of the spotlight is not punishment, but self-preservation. A week later, she showed up unannounced at my brother Nathan Whitaker's house where I had been staying, her car pulling into the driveway, just after sunset when the sky had that flat gray tone that makes everything feel colder than it actually is. And I remember standing up from the kitchen table when I saw her through the front window, because I had not told her where I was, but clearly someone had. Nathan gave me a look that asked whether I wanted him to step in, but I shook my head and walked to the door myself, opening it before she had the chance to knock, because I had no interest in turning the moment into another spectacle. She stood there on the porch wrapped in a long coat, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had driven over in a rush rather than planning some dramatic entrance. And for the first time in weeks, she did not look defiant or polished or prepared for an audience. She looked tired. Her eyes were red, not in the theatrical way of filtered selfies, but in the raw way of someone who had not been sleeping. The cold air hung between us while she tried to gather her thoughts, and when she finally spoke, her voice lacked the sharpness that had defined our last conversations. She said she finally understood that her post had been a reckless attempt to provoke me, that she wanted me to chase her publicly, to comment something possessive or passionate that would signal to everyone watching that I was fighting for her, and that in her mind the absence of that dramatic display meant I did not care enough. She admitted that she never actually believed I would walk away, that she assumed I would argue in the comments or post something equally dramatic that would turn our conflict into a public reconciliation, and when that did not happen, she felt exposed rather than empowered. She confessed that the online attention had felt addictive, that each like and supportive comment gave her a rush of validation that temporarily drowned out the insecurity she had been feeling about aging, about Derek's sudden reappearance, about the way nostalgia makes people feel desired again. On that cold porch, she acknowledged that she had confused digital applause with genuine connection, that she let strangers' reactions carry more weight than the quiet trust we had built over years, and that she had underestimated the consequences of framing me as oppressive just to prove she was desirable and independent. She said she thought the narrative would stay controlled, that it would simply pressure me into proving my devotion in a way that was visible to everyone, and that she did not anticipate I would respond with silence and structural separation instead of jealousy. I listened without interrupting, my hands in the pockets of my coat, the cold seeping through the concrete beneath my shoes, and while I recognized the sincerity in her tone, I also recognized that realization after damage is not the same as prevention before it. I told her that respect is not a trend, and it is not something you test for engagement. That marriage is not a stage where one partner performs empowerment at the expense of the other, and that I would not compete with strangers for my own wife's loyalty. I told her I am not interested in chasing someone who invites applause by painting me as the villain, and that devotion is not proven through public spectacle, but through consistent private integrity. She tried a step closer, her voice softening as she said she wanted to fix this, that she understood now, but I remained still because understanding does not erase the fact that she chose attention over alignment when given the option. I explained that what hurt most was not Derek or the caption, but the willingness to gamble our marriage for validation, and that once someone proves they can turn partnership into performance, trust does not simply reset when the audience leaves. The porch light flickered slightly in the cold wind, illuminating the distance between us more clearly than any online post ever could, and for the first time since this began, I felt certain that whatever happened next would be based on principle rather than panic. Days after that confrontation on my brother's porch, when the air between us had felt colder than the weather itself, a small padded envelope arrived addressed in handwriting I recognized immediately as Lauren's, and I stood in Nathan's kitchen turning it over in my hands before opening it, unsure whether it contained another plea or another performance. Inside was a simple flash drive with no note, no dramatic explanation, just the silent weight of something she clearly intended me to see without framing it through her voice. I carried my laptop to the dining table, plugged it in, and opened the folder, discovering dozens of unsent drafts, private documents saved with dates spanning months, each one a window into thoughts she had never shared aloud. The pages were not polished captions or curated quotes, but raw confessions written in long, unfiltered paragraphs about feeling invisible as she approached 40 in an industry that worships youth and reinvention, about scrolling through social media feeds filled with women reinventing themselves while she felt static, about watching her reflection and wondering when admiration turned into familiarity. She wrote about fearing aging in a competitive environment where desirability is currency, admitting that when Derek reappeared with compliments about how she had not changed since college, it ignited something fragile inside her that she had been too ashamed to name. In those drafts, she described my stable personality not as cruel or controlling, but as steady to the point of predictability, saying that while I provided security and consistency, there were no dramatic highs to broadcast, no sweeping gestures that translated into viral moments, no volatile passion that made for captivating narratives. Reading those documents was like peeling back layers of story I had only experienced from the outside, because beneath the defiance and public empowerment was a woman wrestling with insecurities she did not know how to articulate without feeling weak. She admitted in one entry that she resented how calm I remained during conflicts, interpreting my restraint as indifference rather than composure, and that she sometimes provoked situations simply to feel intensity, to generate proof that she still inspired reaction. She wrote about how likes and comments gave her a measurable sense of worth, something tangible and immediate, whereas the quiet routines of marriage felt invisible in comparison. She confessed that she sometimes felt like supporting character in her own life, and that posting bold declarations made her feel briefly centered. As I scrolled through page after page, I realized she had been fighting internal insecurities by externalizing blame, projecting her fear of aging and irrelevance onto me, because I was safe enough to absorb it, because I did not retaliate theatrically, because I remained grounded even when she sought volatility. Her vulnerability felt real, almost painfully so, and for moments I could see the frightened undercurrent beneath the curated persona, but even that clarity did not rewrite what had already happened. The authenticity of her private struggle did not erase the fact that she publicly undermined our marriage for engagement metrics and social applause, that she framed me as oppressive to validate feelings she had never given me the opportunity to address privately. I closed the final document and sat in silence, aware that understanding someone's insecurity does not obligate you to accept the damage caused by how they choose to cope with it. Compassion and accountability are not mutually exclusive, and while her words revealed depth I had not been shown, they also confirmed that the public narrative had been intentional, not accidental. In that quiet kitchen, with the flash drive still warm from the laptop's port, I understood that empathy could coexist with boundaries, and that recognizing her internal battle did not require me to ignore the external consequences she willingly set in motion. We eventually met at a quiet cafe near Franklin Park on a gray afternoon that matched the subdued tone of everything we had become. And when I walked in, she was already seated by the window with no dramatic entrance, no carefully staged lighting, no phone position to capture the moment, just 2 cups of coffee and a woman who looked smaller without an audience. She did not begin with explanations or defensiveness. She simply apologized face to face without filters or hashtags, her voice steady but stripped of the confidence that once fueled her captions. And she acknowledged plainly that she had used social media as a weapon to regain control in a moment when she felt insecure and unseen. She admitted that provoking me publicly had been an attempt to measure my devotion in a language she had grown addicted to, and that she mistook my calm boundaries for indifference because they did not generate spectacle or immediate emotional intensity. She told me that in hindsight she understood how deeply she had undermined our marriage by inviting strangers into a private fracture, that the validation she chased evaporated as quickly as it arrived, and that what remained was a widening distance she had not anticipated. I listened carefully, not with anger, but with the clarity that had settled into me over the past months, and I told her that I forgave her as a person because I believe her vulnerability was genuine and her insecurities were human, but forgiveness does not automatically restore trust. I explained that reconciliation requires time, consistency, and rebuilding from a foundation that has been intentionally cracked, and that regret expressed after consequences is not the same as integrity demonstrated before damage occurs. There was no shouting, no accusations left to exchange, just the quiet recognition that love alone does not guarantee compatibility when values diverge in moments of pressure. I told her I needed a partner who values quiet dignity over public validation, someone who resolves conflict in private rather than broadcasting it for engagement metrics, and that once a marriage becomes content, it is difficult to separate authenticity from performance. She nodded with tears in her eyes, not dramatic tears, but restrained ones, and she said she understood that some lessons arrived too late to reverse the outcome. In the months that followed, I moved into a condo downtown, a modest but clean space with large windows overlooking the city lights, and I rebuilt my routines piece by piece without needing to document them for anyone else's approval. I returned to early morning runs along the river, focused on my work without scanning a room for emotional volatility, and rediscovered the steadiness in myself that had once been framed as boring but now felt like strength. The silence of my new place was not empty, but grounding, a reminder that identity does not need an audience to exist. Lauren relocated to another state shortly after the divorce was finalized, seeking a fresh start in an environment where her story was not already written, and she set her profiles to private, withdrawing from the public gaze that had once fueled her sense of relevance. From what I understand, she learned in her own time that freedom without accountability feels a lot like isolation, that applause fades but consequences remain, and that independence detached from responsibility becomes hollow. I do not wish her harm, and I carry no bitterness, but I remain certain that choosing dignity over theatrics was the most honest decision I could make for myself, and in that certainty, I found a peace that no viral moment could ever replicate.